There are barks you forget, and then there are the ones that make your blood turn cold. In a quiet coastal town where nothing ever really happened, a lone officer returned home one evening, only to find his German shepherd barking like the devil was behind the door. What that dog sensed, what he stopped, changed everything. But what if the real danger wasn't outside, but had already been inside the house? Would you have noticed the signs? Before we start, tell me where you're watching from. Camden, Maine. Before the door, before the growl, before the line was held. Camden woke slowly in October, not with alarms or the clang of city traffic, but with the hush of fog rolling in off the harbor and the soft clink of masts tapping one another, like old friends exchanging quiet morning greetings. The Magunticook River slipped under the Route 1 bridge like it was trying not to disturb anyone. Leaves, amber and rusted gold, drifted in lazy spirals over the sidewalks. There were days when the whole town seemed to breathe as one. This was one of them. At the edge of Hosmer Pond, in a weathered single-story cabin tucked behind a thicket of red pines, Officer Ben Calder brewed coffee in silence. The kind of silence that wasn't just absence of sound, but the settled hush of a man who had made peace with solitude. The stove popped once. Argo, his German shepherd, looked up from his post near the screen door, ears twitching, not because of the noise but the shift in atmosphere. Dogs know about moods, about men, especially about the ones who carry a weight without showing it. Ben moved slowly through the morning, as if speed might break the peace. He wore routine like armor. Heat the water, pour over grounds, 2 fingers of cream, no sugar. He sat at the kitchen table, thumb tracing a deep scar on the wood from some long-ago dropped carving chisel. The smell of the pond drifted in, damp, earthy, mixed with pine sap, and the memory of summer boats now dry-docked for winter. Outside, Argo remained still. The dog didn't bark without cause, not since the first time he'd heard a siren too close. Something about the pitch sent him into a fit that left his nose bloodied from slamming into the kennel bars. From that day on, he'd stopped barking at all, but the real things. Danger, intrusion, shifts in rhythm that only a working dog's mind could define. Argo was 5 years old now, past the reckless excitement of his rookie K9 days, grown into the gravity of his purpose. Ben appreciated that. Gravity. The world already had enough noise. Before the badge, before the leash, Ben had been a luthier, building guitars from walnut and spruce, coaxing shape and sound from raw wood. That life had faded quietly, not with tragedy, but with discomfort. Performances canceled due to shaking hands, shelves of unfinished instruments, and the growing fear that no one truly needed what he made. The transition to police work had been steady, pragmatic. There were laws, limits, lines to protect. And there was Argo. The dog didn't ask questions. He simply stood watch, and when necessary, stepped forward. Now, most days were calm. Patrols through downtown Camden, stopping by the post office where old Mr. Dabrowski refused to let go of his mail route, despite 2 knee replacements. Small calls. A car alarm set off by wind. A raccoon in a bakery dumpster. A woman named May Whitcomb who locked herself out of her house twice a month and baked apology pies that Ben never accepted but always carried home. It was, in every way, a life of small, quiet things, but something always lingered beneath. A sense that nothing ever truly stayed quiet forever, that the peace was more a pause than a promise. Ben had seen it enough, in the tremble of a domestic call just before voices rose, in the way teenagers fidgeted too long outside gas stations, in the split second of hesitation in Argo's body when something didn't smell right. It wasn't fear, it was intuition. Argo had it in spades. It showed in the subtle shifts, how his tail stiffened when a door opened 3 houses down, how his ears angled to the left before Ben even heard footsteps, how he always slept facing the window. There was loyalty, yes, but there was also something deeper, a kind of knowing. That morning, as Ben zipped up his patrol vest and clipped on his badge, Argo tilted his head toward the back door. Not urgent, just attentive. Ben glanced out, saw nothing, but noted the stillness in the trees. The quiet had grown too thick. He ran his fingers along Argo's collar. The dog's fur was warm, his breath steady. Everything appeared normal. Appearances lie. By 5:32 p.m., Ben would return to this same door and find Argo standing in front of it, body braced, eyes locked on the handle. The silence would fracture. A low growl would rise. Not loud, but deep enough to reach marrow. It would not be a greeting. It would not be fear. It would be something else. A boundary. But that was still hours away. Now Camden carried on. Boats clinked. Fog rolled out to sea. And inside a small cabin near Hosmer Pond, a man and his dog prepared for another ordinary day, unaware that by nightfall they would be the only reason that house still stood. The door. The growl. The line held. It was just past 5:30 when Officer Ben Calder turned off the gravel road onto his drive, the tires of his cruiser crunching over early autumn leaves. The light had gone amber, that fleeting kind of gold that slides through pine boughs and casts long shadows over porch rails. Camden, Maine had already begun preparing for its quiet descent into winter. Porch furniture vanished, gardens covered with tarp, shutters pulled tighter. The cold had not yet arrived, but its echo was already in the wind. Argo had been home since mid-afternoon. Ben had dropped him off after a training refresher with the local K-9 unit. Nothing formal, just keeping scent response sharp. Argo had worked clean, as always. No wasted movement, no confusion. The trainer had made a joke about how that dog wasn't just smart, he was strategic. Ben didn't laugh. He never did at things that were true. Now, as the cruiser slowed to a stop beside the cabin, Argo should have been at the window. He always watched for the return, ears perked, tail thumping against the baseboard. But tonight, there was no silhouette in the glass, no movement, just stillness. Ben stepped out, his boots sinking slightly into the mossy gravel. The evening breeze carried the smell of lake water, the faint iron of decaying leaves, and something else, something he didn't recognize at first. Sharp, faint, sweet. He reached for the back gate and paused. Argo stood on the porch, directly in front of the back door. Rigid, his body angled slightly to the left, weight forward, tail stiff, ears flattened. His gaze was locked on Ben, but there was no greeting in his eyes. No wag, no loping steps, just the low rumble of a growl, rising from deep in his chest like a warning from something ancient. Ben stopped mid-step. It wasn't a bark. Argo never barked without cause. And this sound wasn't threat. It was boundary. Line drawn. His paws spread apart slightly, ready to push if needed. He looked taller. Ben's throat dried as he took in the posture. Argo, he said low. The dog's eyes didn't flicker. The growl didn't stop. Instead, Argo stepped forward. One slow step off the porch, blocking the path between man and door. His eyes never left Ben's face. That was when the smell found him fully, an almost metallic sweetness that didn't belong. Not wood smoke, not pine. Something synthetic. Wrong. His pulse rose, slow but deliberate. He took a half step back, instinct overriding fatigue. The scent wasn't strong, but it caught in the back of his throat, like something that had no business being in the open air. Natural gas. The realization hit not with panic, but with cold understanding. Ben shifted his weight and slowly pulled out his phone, hands steady from years of training. He called the Camden Fire Department direct, not 911. He didn't want sirens. "Captain Harris," he said when the line picked up, "I need a quiet unit at my place. Possible leak. Argo's. He's not letting me inside." There was a pause. Then, "We're on our way." 5 minutes. Ben hung up and sat on the second-to-last step of the back porch. Argo didn't move. He stood a few feet away, muscles taut, eyes never blinking. The silence between them stretched long and full. Ben's hands rested on his knees. He didn't look at his phone again, didn't check the news or scroll email. He just watched the dog that had saved his life more times than anyone knew. He whispered once, "You smelled it before I could." Argo didn't respond, except to lower his head slightly, eyes narrowing toward the door like the threat might still shift. The fire team arrived without fanfare, a quiet utility truck instead of a ladder engine. One tech hopped out with a handheld detector, nodded at Ben, and approached the door. Argo let him pass, but barely. His head tracked every motion. When the detector passed the lower jamb, it beeped once, then again. The light turned amber, then red. "Jesus," the tech muttered, stepping back. "It's full inside. You flip a switch, open the fridge light. This whole place could have lit." Ben closed his eyes briefly. Minutes later, another firefighter located the main gas line, shut it down. A technician crawled under the cabin to trace the leak. He came up pale, holding a length of flexible pipe and a set of fresh tool markings. "Not corrosion," he said grimly. "Someone twisted this. Hard, deliberate." Ben didn't speak. He simply looked at Argo. The dog had sat down now, but still blocked the door. He had known. Before the smell, before the danger had a name, he had known. That night, as the cabin vented out its threat, and the fire team packed up in soft murmurs, Ben stood beside his cruiser and looked back at the porch. The air was clearer now, the sky deeper blue, stars emerging behind the ridge. Argo lay by the threshold, head on paws, tail still, eyes fixed outward like he was waiting for something more. Ben had spent a lifetime listening to what people said. Now, more than ever, he began listening to what dogs didn't. The aftermath, the doubt, the smallest fracture in something once solid. By morning, the scent had dissipated. The windows had stayed open all night, letting in the sea air. It curled through the rooms like a quiet cleansing. Ben stood in his kitchen, staring at the floor where the gas had been, where something meant for warmth had nearly turned this place into kindling. The coffee pot hissed behind him. He didn't move to pour it. Argo lay in the doorway, gaze drifting between Ben and the entryway. No sign of distress, but not asleep either. He hadn't left Ben's side since the fire crew pulled the last wrench from the crawl space. Even now, the dog's breath was slow, measured, but his body was always angled toward the door. Ben finally stepped forward and turned off the coffee pot. The hum stopped, but it didn't bring peace. It brought stillness, the kind that settles in when everything you know has been subtly rearranged. He opened the drawer beside the sink. Inside were his utility bills, a spare key, and a small black device, the hub for his smart home system. He'd installed it for convenience, but it had become a quiet witness. Motion sensors, door logs, thermostat records. Not security exactly, but awareness. A digital memory. Ben synced it to his phone and pulled up the event history. Tuesday, gas leak day. He scrolled to 11:26 a.m. Back door, opened. He blinked. He scrolled again. No earlier entries. He'd been at the station, logged into the dispatch terminal from 8:03 to 4:47. Argo had been picked up for training. The cabin should have been empty. 11:28 a.m. Kitchen motion detected. 11:33 a.m. No new motion. 11:34 a.m. Back door, closed. Ben set the phone down slowly. Someone had been inside for exactly 8 minutes. No drawers were open. Nothing was taken. No mess. Just the smell. Just the pipe. And a lighter. He moved toward the laundry room. It still smelled faintly of lavender detergent and clean cotton, but his hand hesitated before opening the supply cabinet. Behind the bleach bottle, half tucked into the corner behind the stack of dryer sheets, sat a disposable candle lighter. Black, plastic, not his. He reached for a latex glove and picked it up. The weight was wrong, heavier than expected. Used recently. A smear of grease along the side like it had been handled with oily hands. His eyes narrowed. It hadn't been left by mistake. It had been placed. A message. Or worse, a fuse. He stepped back, his shoulders tight. Outside, Argo had risen and was staring at the fence line. A breeze rustled the pine needles overhead, and somewhere down the hill, a loon called from the pond like a thread unraveling. Ben walked to the back door, opened it, and let Argo lead. The dog moved cautiously, not rushed, nose twitching along the porch boards, then down the stairs. He stopped beside the gate. The latch was closed, but the padlock was missing. Not broken, just not there. Ben knelt to examine it. The chain had been reset, but the lock was clearly jimmied. He reached forward and tested the swing. The gate creaked, then clicked. It didn't latch clean anymore. It had been forced open and shut again with care, like someone wanted it to look untouched. He exhaled through his nose and straightened. The signs were stacking. Someone had entered his home, left no visible trace, and walked out with a gas leak behind them and a lighter in hiding. He wasn't sure what chilled him more, that it could have killed him, or that it was meant to. Inside, he called it in. Not as an emergency, just a report. Quiet. A note for the watch logs. A personal flag. He left out the part about Argo, about the growl, about the way the dog had moved like he was guarding not just a house but something sacred. After the report, Ben sat on the porch again, same spot as the night before, only now the air felt different, less like home, more like territory. Argo lay beside him, one paw over the porch slat, as if he meant to hold the structure down with his own weight. The wind picked up, but neither of them flinched. Later that evening, Ben took his service weapon from its locked drawer and checked it, out of habit more than fear. He placed it beside his bed. He wasn't the paranoid type, had never been. But the events didn't add up. Accidents didn't hide lighters. Gas leaks didn't twist lines with tool marks. And dogs didn't growl at their own front door unless something had already crossed the threshold. Before he turned in, he stood in the doorway of the laundry room again. The cabinet still ajar. The scent almost entirely gone. The lighter now sealed in a plastic evidence bag on his kitchen counter. A small object, but heavy in implication. He glanced at Argo, who sat in the hallway, unmoving. "You knew," he said quietly. The dog didn't move, didn't blink, just sat still, spine straight, ears pointed forward, like he was listening for something the house hadn't finished saying. Old names return. A trail of oil and silence. The next morning, Ben Calder walked into the records room of the Camden Police Department before anyone had finished their first cup of coffee. He didn't speak. He didn't greet. He just moved straight to the drawer labeled Open Municipal Violations, July to September, unlocked it, and began flipping through the incident files one by one. His badge was clipped to his belt, his service piece still holstered from the night before. But his hands moved like he wasn't an officer at all, like he was a craftsman again, sorting grain patterns on wood, looking for a hidden fracture only he could see. 3 weeks earlier, he had written up a contractor for illegal gas work on a private renovation off Route 90, minor on paper, dangerous in practice. The man had routed an unauthorized feed from the neighbor's main line, bypassing inspection, bypassing safety. Ben had followed the procedure to the letter, reported it, shut it down, and cited the foreman. The file had felt routine at the time. Now it didn't. He found the name on the 7th folder. Silas Creekmore, 48. Owner-operator of a small outfit based in Rockland. Former union-trained welder turned private contractor after a failed permit renewal. Fined twice in the last 5 years for code violations. Both times the infractions involved natural gas lines. Both times the citations were issued by small-town officers. Both times those officers had reported follow-up harassment. Ben hadn't thought to dig deeper before. He hadn't needed to. He stood motionless for a moment, staring at the name. Then he opened the file wider. Attached to the back was a short paragraph, a typed complaint from Silas, addressed to the Camden Building Inspection Office. Officer Ben Calder has cost me not just money, but a man's dignity. I will not forget the damage done. You take food out of a man's hand. Don't be surprised when he comes looking for the plate. Ben exhaled, slow and steady. It wasn't a threat, not in the legal sense, but it wasn't an apology either. That evening, just after dusk, Ben drove 30 miles south to Rockland Harbor. The town there was sharper than Camden. Less postcard, more rusted edge. Fishing boats groaned on their anchors. Warehouse windows reflected the cold light of sodium street lamps. It was the kind of place where ghosts hid behind garage doors, and the smell of salt never quite covered the diesel. Ben didn't wear his uniform. He parked 2 blocks off the water and walked along the edge of a gravel lot lined with half-abandoned shipping containers. Argo rode in the back seat, alert but silent. His nose was pressed to the glass until the cruiser stopped. Then he let out a breath and waited. Ben opened the rear hatch and unclipped the kennel. Let's see what's here. Argo stepped down without a sound. His tail was low. His eyes scanned the shadows. And then, He moved, nose to the ground, not in circles, in a line. Ben followed. They passed 3 rows of containers before Argo paused. A dented silver trailer with a broken hinge on the left door stood slightly open. Inside, tarps, oil drums, and something else. On the floor of the container, half crushed beneath a pair of worn work boots, was a grease-streaked glove, latex, black. It looked cheap, but Argo moved toward it with immediate focus. He sniffed, once, twice, then sat, still, locked. Ben crouched beside him and reached out carefully with a tissue, lifting the glove into a plastic evidence pouch. On the fingertips, thin residue, a mix of gas oil and something bitter, almost chemical, not just sweat, not just dirt. Ben didn't speak. Argo's stillness was enough. From there, the trail went cold, until Argo lifted his head again and sniffed toward the edge of the lot. His ears perked, nose twitching faster now. He trotted ahead, down a dirt path lined with tire ruts. Ben followed, boots crunching softly over old pine needles and glass fragments. The path led them toward Owl's Head, a sparsely developed strip of woods and rock that hugged the bay like a tired arm. The moon had risen halfway above the tree line, silvering everything. They reached a clearing where a decommissioned seafood processing shack stood like a rusted ribcage, its sign still flapping in the wind, though the roof had collapsed years ago. Argo approached the wall. His posture shifted again, not aggressive, but not relaxed. His body angled toward the left side of the structure, where a small window, long broken, still had streaks of grease on the sill. Ben swept his flashlight once, then again. Inside, nothing alive. But scattered across the floor, wrappers, a crushed energy drink can, a page from a Rockland Utilities map, corner torn and creased. He stepped closer and reached through the broken pane. The map had a red circle, drawn heavy over a small residential grid. Camden. Ben flipped it over. On the back, a name was scribbled in smudged ink. Calder. Argo didn't move. He simply sat, breathing steady, his eyes on the tree line behind them. Somewhere out there, Silas Creekmore had marked a home and circled a man's name. Not to steal, not to threaten, to erase. Ben folded the paper once, then again. He looked at Argo. The dog stared back, unmoved. Somewhere, a second line had already been drawn. And Argo had decided exactly where he would stand. The shape of a mind revealed, and the eyes that never blink. The morning fog off Penobscot Bay rolled thick over the town like a held breath. It crept through alleyways and drifted over rooftops, silencing birdsong and dulling the sound of early traffic. In the precinct evidence room, Ben stood beneath the humming fluorescent lights, hands gloved, the scent box open in front of him. Beside him stood Manny Ortiz, a K-9 handler from Belfast PD with 20 years of scent work behind him and the patience of a man who knew dogs better than most people. He was broad-shouldered, soft-spoken, the kind of man whose presence filled a room without pushing the air out. He had brought the equipment himself. Stainless steel box, 4 scent chambers. 3 were loaded with blanks, sterile cloth. One held a gauze square that had been rubbed gently against the black glove found at the Rockland shipping yard. Labeled, sealed, logged. Manny had also brought a few other things, a set of control samples, a tight smile, and confidence that Argo could do what most dogs couldn't. Ben stepped back as Argo entered the room, his harness snug, his body still relaxed. But the moment the scent box came into view, something shifted behind his eyes. Focus. A narrowing. Manny gave no command, just a hand signal. Argo approached the first chamber, sniffed. Nothing. The second. Same. The third. He froze. Ears back. Shoulders stiff. He barked. Once, loud, then again, then sat, rigid. Manny marked the moment, eyes never leaving the dog. "Locked," he said. "It's the same scent." Ben said nothing, just stared at Argo. There was a finality in the dog's posture, the kind of certainty you don't teach, you witness. "You got a suspect?" Manny asked quietly. "Yeah," Ben replied, voice low. "Name's Silas Creekmore, small-time contractor. I cited him last month for an illegal tap. Lost a big contract after that." "He hold a grudge?" Ben looked down at the glove in its sealed bag. "He doesn't just hold it. He's feeding it." Manny nodded slowly. "This isn't random." "No," Ben said. "This is personal." Outside, the sun had started burning off the fog. Inside, the weight of what had been confirmed settled deep into Ben's spine. This wasn't vandalism. It wasn't negligence. It was calculated, premeditated sabotage, masked as a gas leak with intent to destroy. Someone had entered his home, tampered with the gas line, left a lighter behind, not just to make a point, but to make a statement in fire. But Argo had stopped it, just by doing what he'd been trained and born to do. Ben's mind returned to the torn map from the processing shack. The circle over Camden, his name written on the back like it was part of a blueprint. That wasn't planning. That was fixation. He needed more, not guesses, not instinct. He needed a location. He returned to the shack near Owl's Head that afternoon, alone this time. Fog had lifted, but the shadows inside were still thick. He scanned the interior with a UV light, checking every edge of wall, every drawer, every corner of rusted crate. Nothing until the very back, behind a fallen beam and a stack of warped floor tiles. He found a wooden milk crate, half covered in a tarp. Inside, a cracked flashlight, empty cigarette box, 3 wrenches, and an envelope sealed with tape. He peeled it open carefully. Inside were 6 printed photographs, all candid, all taken at different times of day. Ben walking Argo near Hosmer Pond. Ben getting out of his cruiser at the grocery store. Ben returning home with a takeout bag. All from a distance. All from someone who knew how to follow without being seen. But one photo was different. It was taken from behind Ben's cabin, from the edge of the trees just past the fence line. A red circle had been drawn in pen, not around Ben, but around Argo. Ben's jaw tightened. He left the shack quietly and drove back through the harbor. The photos laid out on the passenger seat like silent accusations. When he pulled into the station, the precinct lights flickered on automatically. Inside, he met with Captain LaRue, briefed her, laid out the evidence. She asked if he needed a unit on his home. He said no. But the look in his eyes said otherwise. Back home, the cabin was still, too still. Ben walked the perimeter before entering, flashlight in hand, feet slow, careful. Nothing seemed out of place, but every shadow felt different now. Every creak of the floorboards was a question. Argo paced with him, no longer simply following. He was mirroring, guarding. That night, Ben slept on the couch, weapon within arm's reach. Argo at the foot of the door, ears twitching even in sleep. At 2:38 a.m., Ben woke to a low growl. He didn't move. Argo stood, not barking, just staring out the window. Ben followed his gaze. Outside, past the trees, past the gravel path, in the direction of the processing shack. A flicker of movement. Not big, just a shift in the dark. And then, a camera flash. Quick, silent, gone. Ben's breath caught. Argo growled deeper now. They were being watched, not hunted, not yet, but studied. Now that the hunter was known, the lines could be drawn, and one paw was already over that line. By dawn, the fog had lifted into nothing but dew on the pine needles. A wind off the harbor pressed against the cabin walls, whistling faintly through the joints like a warning trying to speak. Ben sat at the edge of his kitchen table, a ceramic mug cooling in his hand, the steam long gone. The photos were spread before him, each one a time-stamped insult, a quiet threat from someone who hadn't just broken into his property, but had crawled into the margins of his life. He traced the red pen circle on the photo of Argo. It wasn't just about him anymore, if it ever had been. He stood slowly, walked to the back door, and let it creak open. Argo stepped out first, head low, scanning. Even the squirrels seemed more cautious today. Ben called LaRue again, this time not to inform, but to act. He requested a warrant to search Tilson Avenue, an old cannery off Rockland Harbor that had fallen out of use in the early 2000s. It had become a place of rust and pigeons, a footprint of better days. But it sat on the outer loop of Silas Creekmore's old gas infrastructure contracts. If Silas wanted to hide gear, stage attacks, or observe movement undetected, it would be the perfect place. No cameras, no people, no reason for anyone to look. LaRue agreed to expedite the request. The evidence had tipped, intent had become visible, and so had pattern. Ben didn't wait for backup. He loaded his gear, checked his firearm, and slipped Argo into his harness. The sun was climbing, but the air still tasted of steel and salt. They drove south along Route 1 past the boatyards and shuttered seafood joints, to the edge of the industrial zone where the old cannery leaned like a tired shipwreck. The gates were rusted but unlocked. Ben stepped through carefully, crunching glass beneath his boots, the sound too loud in the emptiness. Argo moved beside him like shadow, body taut but silent. The interior smelled of old brine and sawdust, the kind of rot that doesn't just live, it clings. They passed rusted hooks, fallen beams, coiled wire, and seaweed that had somehow found a way to live inside concrete. Then Argo stopped, froze, nose twitching. His body turned hard toward a wall that looked no different from the others, except for a faint draft seeping through the boards. Ben approached, looked closer. A seam in the planks. Not natural. He pressed gently. A section of paneling gave way, revealing a hollow cavity no wider than a filing cabinet. Inside, tucked in canvas and foam, were items that did not belong here. A coil of flexible gas pipe, a wrench, sharpened at the tip, a T-junction valve labeled in red marker, C7 Ben, a laminated map showing the entire residential gas line overlay of Camden, including cross streets, elevation points, and pressure ratings. And there, circled in red ink, again, was his house. Again. Ben stepped back. He took it all in slowly. This wasn't just a personal vendetta anymore. It was operational, repeatable. He radioed it in, called for evidence processing, took photos, sealed the panel with a strip of caution tape. Back at the precinct, the mood had shifted. LaRue called it a game changer. No one could look at it now and still call it a grudge gone too far. This was domestic sabotage, skirting the line of terrorism. But Ben wasn't thinking of charges. He was thinking of Harbor Park. It was fall festival season. The trawlers had been decked with flags. Pop-up booths were selling everything from boiled peanuts to miniature lighthouses. Families packed the lawn, and mobile kitchens lined the gravel path, each one hooked to propane. Ben had a gut feeling that gnawed like bone. If Silas had failed to trap Ben at home, he might shift targets, not to kill him directly, but to make him responsible. A leak, an explosion, a fire. And Ben standing there, again, holding the aftermath. He needed to move fast. That evening, Ben rerouted his patrol detail. Argo rode up front, head level with the window, eyes scanning like searchlights. As they approached Harbor Park, the crowd thickened. Kids with cider, dogs on leashes, local folk bands tuning guitars. It felt warm, joyful, but to Ben, it pulsed like a powder keg. He parked discreetly, out of the flow of foot traffic. Argo leapt down before him, already alert. Together, they walked the perimeter of the park, not fast, not drawing attention. Just two figures on a slow circuit, eyes everywhere. And then, Argo stopped. At the far end of the lawn, near a food truck painted with chowder bowls and lobster claws, he crouched low, sniffed once, then stiffened, his tail leveled out, not wagging. Ben knelt beside him. A thin trail of gas, almost invisible, crept from beneath the wooden trailer ramp. The same oily, artificial sweetness he'd smelled outside his own home days earlier. He looked at the tank connections. One of them had been tampered with. Twisted hard, then wrenched partially open. Just enough for gas to pool, unseen. Ben moved quickly, calmly. Radioed in a quiet code. The Camden FD, already on site for safety standby, moved in fast. No sirens, no panic. They cleared the area around the truck, shut the valves, secured the zone. One firefighter looked back at Ben after crawling under the trailer. That thing was rigged, man. Just needed one faulty lighter. Ben didn't speak. His eyes were already scanning the crowd. And Argo was pulling at the leash again, toward the marina, toward the wind. The threat had moved, but so had the line between man and monster. The festival kept playing its happy tune. Children tugged at oversized balloons, and vendors kept shouting over one another about kettle corn and apple cider. From the outside, it was another small-town celebration, New England in full postcard mode. But something beneath it had changed. The ground had shifted, subtle but undeniable, like the moment before ice begins to crack under weight. Ben didn't run. He walked, with Argo close at his heel, zigzagging through families and food trucks, not drawing attention. But inside, the rhythm of his thoughts had become percussion, tight, sharp, percussive. His heart wasn't racing. It was too focused for that. Everything narrowed into signal and noise. Argo pulled again, now more forcefully, past the folding chairs where two old veterans argued over the best chowder recipe, past the dunk tank, where a soaked teenager laughed like he didn't know the air smelled faintly of danger. The trail curved toward the side of the marina, where the gravel path thinned into the docks. Open space, fewer eyes. That's when Ben saw it. Not the man, the SUV, sand-colored, stripped of all decals but not clean. Flecks of construction residue around the back tires. A single sticker torn halfway, barely readable, but Ben had seen enough in his years to recognize the shape. Old utility access permit. It sat parked, engine off, windows up, tucked against a hedge like it belonged to someone browsing lobster traps. But it was pointed at the festival exit, not the booths, the escape route. Ben stepped back, gently tapped the mic clipped to his shoulder. Plate check, main tags, partial, 2BR4, looked like a D or P, sand SUV, Tilson type, marked. Dispatch began to respond, but the static cracked. Interference. Argo growled low in his chest, not loud, but urgent. Then he saw the man. Silas was clever, but not flawless. He had trimmed the beard, traded his boots for running shoes, thrown a windbreaker over his usual canvas layers. He was walking slow, mixing into the stream of people leaving the park early. A dad, maybe. Just a guy who'd had enough noise. But Argo knew. The scent burned through layers of disguise like wildfire through dry pine. His body stiffened. Hackles up. One paw raised, eyes locked. Ben exhaled and followed, heart steady. He didn't draw his weapon. Not yet. He didn't want panic. Not here. Not in front of the children and retirees and teenagers pretending to be tough. He wanted quiet resolution. He wanted the last chapter closed clean. Silas sensed it. Some primal clock ticked inside him and told him you've been seen. He looked over his shoulder, not directly at Ben, not exactly, but the way you look when you're pretending not to look. His eyes flicked to Argo. And for a moment, the mask cracked. Recognition. Fear. Silas turned. He didn't run. He moved fast. Too fast to be casual, not fast enough to spark alarm. He slid between two vendor tents, into the shade of the cotton candy truck, past the generator hum. Ben followed. Argo surged ahead. They reached the edge of the dockyard. Footsteps on wood. Splinters groaning under weight. Silas moved faster now, cutting through the rows of stacked traps and crates, aiming for the far end where the old dinghies bobbed like loose teeth. Then he broke into a sprint. Now the scene split. No more crowd. No more festival. Just wind and salt, wood and water. Ben gave chase. Argo tore forward, a streak of muscle and fur and absolute intent. Silas zigzagged, trying to break the line of sight. He tossed a crate behind him. Argo vaulted it like it was mist. He clipped a ladder. Ben ducked and cleared it, body low, breath measured. A dock cleat caught Silas's foot. He stumbled but recovered. Reached a maintenance shack at the far end. Kicked the door open. Slammed it behind him. Ben slowed as he approached. Hand on weapon. Argo stood in front of the door, silent but coiled. Inside, no sound. He gave it 3 seconds, then kicked. The door burst open, crashing against the inner wall. The shack was empty. Just fishing gear, rope, a folding stool. But the back window was open. Ben crossed fast, looked out. Silas was already halfway down the embankment toward the boat launch ramp, moving toward a rusted John boat tied loose on one end. Probably didn't even check the motor. Just needed distance. Ben reached for the radio. Still static. He cursed, snapped his fingers. Argo spun, locked eyes, and in one clean motion, they were airborne again. As they descended the slope, Ben could hear the rope mooring stretch, fibers groaning under stress. Silas was already on board, pushing off with one foot. Then Argo did something Ben hadn't seen since their academy training. He barked once, sharp, like a gunshot. Silas froze, turned back, and for the first time he saw not a dog, but judgment. Sometimes the quietest bark hits the loudest nerve. Silas didn't say anything. He didn't have to. The tension in his face, the flicker in his hands, the half-second delay as he adjusted his footing, everything about him screamed cornered. The kind of man who once believed in shortcuts, then started believing in payback when the shortcuts closed. His foot slipped again, just an inch on the algae-slick concrete of the boat ramp, and that's when Ben knew he had a decision window no wider than a heartbeat. Ben stopped just above the slope. Argo remained at his side. No leash, no command. Only breath synced with his handler, ears cupped forward, reading every micro-movement from the man below. The John boat had begun to drift from the shore, not from any engine power, but the slow push of tide and chance. A crooked rope still tethered it on one side, though barely. The festival noise was now just a distant murmur behind the trees, the kind that sounded like it belonged to another life. Then, in a twist of the ordinary turning lethal, Ben heard it. A soft hiss, almost too faint to register, but Argo's body stiffened again. Not toward Silas this time, but the area under the dock, where a rusty food trailer had been parked earlier in the day. Ben's gaze flicked across the space, his eyes tracing the subtle bend of shadow and pipework underneath the old chowder trailer. It wasn't parked right. It was too close to the edge of the dock, and had no business sitting so still this late into teardown. Then his nostrils caught the trace. Gas. Again. Ben pivoted. Argo. Check, he said quietly, the only word spoken in minutes. Argo broke away, tail low, moving with surgical focus beneath the trailer. His nose tracked a pattern invisible to the human eye, tracing the edge of a hose that had been taped along the undercarriage. It fed into a shallow cavity lined with towels soaked through with some kind of liquid meant to slow dispersion, long enough to delay scent detection by anyone but a trained nose. Ben crouched, lifted one flap of the towel with the edge of his multi-tool. The tape underneath wasn't commercial grade. It was gas line grade. There was a DIY valve hidden beneath it, half twisted open. Another trap. This one meant for the crowd. Ben stepped back, reached for his emergency beacon. Still dead. Static. Interference. He looked at Argo. The shepherd had laid down, not in exhaustion, but in an alert block position, facing the crowd's direction. His ears pivoted, searching. Time compressed. Decision came fast. Ben lunged forward, grabbed the trailer's emergency shutoff. He twisted hard, breaking the lock that was crudely fastened around it. With a metallic groan, the hiss cut out. He didn't exhale. Not yet. From behind him, footsteps. Ben whirled around, weapon raised. It wasn't Silas. It was a blur. Someone running, ducking behind one of the skiffs. Then, a click, from the other direction. Ben turned again, fast, this time for real. Silas. Half his body now back on the boat ramp, soaked from the knees down, one hand reaching for the same wrench Ben had seen in the evidence locker photo. Pipe grip handle, rusted from years in basements, a weapon in close quarters. Not clean, not smart, but desperate. And desperation was exactly the kind of thing Ben had been trained to read like a second language. Don't, Ben said, voice low, steady. Silas didn't blink. His fingers tightened. Then Argo growled. Not the bark of earlier. This was different. It was personal, guttural, and yet still measured. A warning built on 5 years of restraint. Silas faltered. Ben took a step down the ramp. I don't need to take you in dirty, Ben said, more to the air than the man. The boat creaked against the dock as Silas shifted again. Then his foot caught the same algae patch. This time, there was no recovery. He slipped hard, his shoulder slamming into the edge of the boat's side. The wrench skittered, clanging down the slope, stopping only when Argo placed a single paw on its handle. Ben moved fast, closed the space, kicked the wrench farther away. Silas was trying to sit up, but the fall had knocked his breath clean out of him. Argo didn't lunge. He didn't bite. He just stood between the two men, a wall, not a weapon. Ben knelt beside Silas, checked for weapons, cuffed him without a word. His own breath had finally quickened, but not from fear, from the gravity of what could have been. He stood, looked around. The crowd behind the trees was still there, still humming with post-festival scatter, utterly unaware that their safety had just been preserved by a dog and a man who had both spent too long learning how to read danger, not when it shouted, but when it whispered. Back at his side, Argo nudged Ben's hip once, not a command, not even pride, just a check-in, and in that tiny motion, everything else fell silent. Some men walk into darkness. Others learn to track it, inch by inch, heartbeat by heartbeat. The fog off the Atlantic was thickening by the hour, rolling inland like a silent tide that erased the familiar. Owl's Headlight, perched atop its wind-scoured bluff, flashed in slow, steady intervals, sending arcs of white across the rocks and salt grass. The coastline here wasn't built for comfort. It was built for warning. Cracked stone, cold steel, the kind of place that whispered danger without ever raising its voice. Ben stood outside his cruiser, the engine idling low behind him, casting soft warmth on the gravel. He'd turned down backup, not because he wanted to play hero, but because he knew Silas didn't operate well in crowds. That man made his moves in the blind spots, in unlit gaps between regulation and routine. Argo was at his side, fur slick from ocean air, body humming with restrained energy. He wasn't leashed. He didn't need to be. Not here. Not with this. Inside the glove box was a folded sheet of paper. On it, a crude map hand-drawn by a gas tech from Camden FD, tracing underground service lines, feeder pipes, and a curious cluster of pressure irregularities logged just south of Owl's Head, the same coordinates where Silas had been spotted multiple times by harbor workers over the past month. Ben had stared at that map for hours before it clicked. Silas wasn't just striking out in anger. He was building something, a sequence, a message. Ben pulled his coat tighter and began walking toward the edge of the bluff, Argo following without sound. The narrow trail curved along a spine of rock that dropped hard into black water on one side and thickets of pine on the other. Somewhere beyond the trees was a long abandoned maintenance shed used decades ago when the lighthouse still had a keeper. It hadn't been on any official maps in years, but Argo found it. He stopped halfway down the trail and turned sharply left, nose to the ground, tail stiff. Ben followed, flashlight sweeping in an arc that caught rusted corrugated metal behind a curtain of sea-lashed firs. The shed was half collapsed on one side, but intact enough to hide someone desperate, and maybe ready to die with a final act of sabotage. Ben drew his weapon low and quiet. Argo moved forward, slow, calculated, reading the world through scent and tension. There was no bark, just breath. Inside, the air was dense, damp with mildew, rust, and something sharper. Motor oil, maybe. Gasoline. A tool belt hung from a hook in the corner, neatly arranged in a way that didn't match the chaos around it. There were schematics spread across a battered workbench, a pipe cutter resting on top of a gas line diagram with Ben's street circled in red ink. A flash of motion. To the left. Ben ducked instinctively as a shadow moved behind a wall of shelves. The glint of metal. The sound of a wrench clattering to the floor. Silas. Ben's voice was steady, aimed not at intimidation, but clarity. This ends now. A beat. Then, you don't get to say when it ends. The voice came from behind a stack of old fish crates, strained, shaking. You tried twice. You missed. You think a third's gonna make the math work? Silas stepped into view slowly. Hands slightly raised, one of them clutching a valve key slick with oil. His eyes were rimmed red, sleepless, hollow. You took everything, he muttered. You did that, Ben replied, eyes locked. I filed a report. You lit the match. Silas laughed, a short, bitter bark that echoed wrong in the tight space. No, I built the whole damn thing, and you took the contract, the crew, my name. You think gas is what matters here? He pointed the valve key like it was a compass. People like you get to screw up and still get thanked at festivals. I miss a payment. I'm a threat. Argo's growl vibrated through the floorboards, a low warning. I didn't screw up, Ben said. I just didn't look away. Silas lunged, half rage, half despair, but not at Ben. He spun toward the far wall, toward something half hidden under a tarp. Ben moved fast. Argo faster. The shepherd closed the gap like a breath drawn sharp. Body slamming into Silas mid-step, driving him hard into the corner, disarming him with force just shy of fracture. Ben closed in, weapon steady. Don't move. Silas didn't. He couldn't. Argo was pinning him, chest low, teeth bared inches from a throat that still pulsed with adrenaline. Then came the shift. The man who had tried to kill him twice, who had nearly turned a public park into a graveyard, looked up, blinking fast. I wasn't gonna light it, Silas mumbled. Not really. Just wanted you to see. What? Ben asked, voice flat. How it feels to be scared where you sleep. Ben held that stare for several seconds longer than protocol required. Then he holstered his weapon, stepped forward, and called Argo off with a single, low whistle. The dog returned to his side instantly. Mission complete. Outside, the fog was peeling back from the trees, as if the land had held its breath and was finally exhaling. The sound of the ocean came clearer now. Real waves, real time. Ben radioed it in. Coordinates, suspect, evidence secured. The answer came back through static. Copy en route. And just like that, the weight shifted. He stepped out of the shed, Argo at his heel, both of them silent. Not triumphant, just steady. Not all rescues come with sirens. Some arrive on 4 quiet paws and change everything in their silence. The fog lifted slowly over Camden Harbor, like a hand being gently pulled from the face of something long hidden. Morning light came cool and thin, slipping between pine needles and catching on the dew-frosted porch of the small cabin near Hosmer Pond. The world hadn't changed, but something in it had, or rather, someone. Ben stood at the edge of his porch, cradling a clay mug with both hands. Peppermint steam curled into the air, lost quickly in the cold. His knuckles still bore faint scrapes from that night, but his grip was steady. In the distance, the woods whispered with the hush of early fall wind. Beside him, Argo lay stretched out in the sun, half dozing, but always aware. The German shepherd didn't need applause or medals. He had the porch. He had the quiet. He had Ben. That was enough. Inside the cabin, hanging by the door, was a handmade plaque carved from white pine. The edges were imperfect, the letters clean and deep. Argo held the line. Ben had sanded it smooth over 3 nights, his hands knowing exactly where to press, where to soften. It wasn't for visitors. It wasn't for show. It was for the one who stayed, when staying mattered most. After the arrest, after the headlines faded and the evidence was logged, Ben didn't go back to business as usual. There was no ribbon cutting, no official commendation. That was never his rhythm. He filed his reports, backed up the scent chain with Ortiz, followed protocol down to the last signature. But something lingered, not fear, not even anger, a kind of wakefulness, a deeper awareness of how close everything had come to unraveling. He started walking the long way to work again. Past May Whitcomb's front steps, where a pot of marigolds somehow still bloomed despite the season. The old librarian had stopped by 2 days after the incident with a request as soft as wind. Her late husband's guitar had sat silent for years. Could Ben make it sing again? He hadn't said yes, just held out his hands and took the case. The guitar was old and loved to the point of near collapse. Strings rusted. Bridge warped, but Ben worked on it slow, deliberate, like he was kneeling beside something sacred. Every night, after patrol, with Argo curled at his feet, Ben sanded, glued, tuned, and waited. Until one Thursday evening, sound came back. Thin at first, then fuller. It wasn't just the strings. It was what they held. Memory, grief, connection. May came to listen the next morning, sitting on a chair in his yard wrapped in her late husband's old fisherman's sweater. Ben played 3 songs without speaking. She cried quietly through the second, then left with a hand on his shoulder and a single word, "Thank you." Argo watched her go, tail thumping once against the porch, a signal, a punctuation mark. After that, word spread in whispers. Calder repairs old guitars. No charge, no rush. Just drop it off on the porch with a note. People started doing just that. The man who'd once gone silent under pressure, who had walked away from music because the stage was too bright, now played quietly into dusk, unafraid of being heard. In a town that often forgot its own name after tourist season, something had shifted. Kids waved when he drove by. Retirees dropped off muffins with old harmonicas tucked beside. A former addict left behind a broken mandolin with a note, "Fixing this so I don't break again." Ben didn't fix people. He didn't preach. He just did what Argo did, stood steady in the doorway when it mattered. He listened. He stayed. And slowly, the town stayed with him. Argo's plaque wasn't the only marker of that season. The boulder near the Harbor Park trailhead now bore a small bronze plate. In honor of unseen guardians, both human and canine, who held the line. No names, no dates, just truth. On rainy nights, Ben still walked the perimeter of his property, just to check. Argo followed, ears perked, nose tilted into the breeze. Sometimes they'd stop beneath the big sugar maple by the fence, and Ben would rest a hand on Argo's back and whisper, not words of thanks, but something simpler, an exhale that only the dog could hear. The past hadn't disappeared. It never does. But it had been reshaped through fire, through quiet acts of loyalty, through a single bark that had refused to be ignored, and in its place grew something else. Music again. Trust again. The slow return of people who believed in small goodnesses. The kind that didn't come with banners. The kind that came with paws on wood floors and warm breath at your side. The kind that stays,